member for Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to support the government's motion to disagree with the amendment made by the Senate to Bill C-4. In fact, I'm saddened to have to speak on this bill again. Bill C-4 was passed by this House with no amendments and sent to the other place where it was adopted at second reading and where it also went through the committee process, again with no amendments being tabled or adopted. However, at third reading, certain members of the other House did propose amendments. Of course, as parliamentarians, it is certainly appropriate to study legislation before either place, to propose amendments that would improve or clarify the bill at hand. In this instance, Mr. Speaker, the amendments that were proposed served to completely gut the bill. Senator Tannas' amendment would have had Bill C-525 from the previous government reinstated, and Senator Dagenais' amendment would have done the same with the previous government's Bill C-377. The latter was subsequently withdrawn, so I'll speak to the remaining amendment. The system of card check for union certification seems to be a preoccupation with Conservative members in this House, as well as in the other place. One can put it down to ideology, I suppose, or consternation that something their party, their government, while in government, had put in place is being dismantled. That is understandable, Mr. Speaker. But what is less understandable is the fact that the Conservatives continue to try to resurrect a law that has been judged by nonpartisan experts to be unfair and unnecessary. In the view of Andrew Sims, Vice Chair of the 1996 Task Force to review the Canada Labour Code, and I quote, "The two bills that are repealed by Bill C-4 both had the air of one side seeking political intervention for more ideological, economic, or relationship reasons, and they have corroded the view that legislative reform at the federal level is based on a tripartite model," end quote. At committee, we heard testimony from respected experts, both employer and employee stakeholders, and academics, that the previous government's Bill C-525 was a law that was enacted on the false premise that it was indeed the very bedrock of democracy, but nothing could be further from the truth. Conservatives like to compare the union certification process to elections, but expert after expert, testimony and evidence debunked this claim. The analogy, simply put, Mr. Speaker, is a false one. Here's what Professor Slynn, Associate Professor at Osgoode Hall Law School at York University, had to say about the previous government's Bill C-525. There is a faulty political election analogy at work here. Mandatory vote supporters commonly rely on a political election analogy founded on the view that certification votes are analogous to political campaigns and elections. The attraction of this argument is understandable, appealing as it does to the ideas of free speech and informed choice and workplace democracy, but it's a false analogy. The nature of union representation is not analogous to government power or political representation, and as a result, the nature of decision-making in a union vote is not analogous to that in a political election. First, the nature of the decision is different. Certification doesn't transform the employment relationship. It simply introduces the union as the employee's agent for the limited purpose of bargaining and administering any collective agreement that the union may be able to negotiate. The employer's overriding economic authority over employees continues in any event. Secondly, there is no non-representation outcome possible in the political context. In political elections, citizens vote between two or more representatives. There is no option to be unrepresented. So, if union representation elections were to be analogous to political elections, then it would be a vote among different collective employer representatives with no option for non-representation. And that simply is not the system that we have here anywhere in Canada, end quote. It seems appropriate for me to once again refer to the testimony of Professor Slynn, who also addressed the issue of the card check versus secret ballot votes for union certification. In terms of cards being a reliable measure of employee support, it is often contended that votes more accurately indicate employees' desire for union representation than cards, suggesting that card-based certification fosters union misconduct to compel employees to sign cards. Although this is possible, there is no evidence, either in academic studies or in the case law from jurisdictions that use this procedure, that it is a significant or widespread problem. Anecdote isn't evidence, and it certainly shouldn't be a compelling basis for legislative change in the face of a lot of academic research finding that mandatory vote systems have negative effects on labor relations and that employer interference in certification is indeed significant and a widespread problem, end quote. Mr. Speaker, my Conservative colleagues want to seriously curtail, I believe, the abilities of Canadians to join unions. Whenever there has been adversity suffered by working people or unfair or unsafe working conditions, unions have been there to advocate for fairness, for safer and more humane working conditions. Unions have been at the forefront of raising awareness and fighting for issues that affect everyone, from the dangers of asbestos in the workplace to the plight of the next generation of workers facing a future of temporary and precarious work.
That's right.
I am proud to recognize the efforts of the labour movement in Canada in educating Canadians about the scourge of asbestos, and I know all Canadians look forward to the day when asbestos is finally banned in Canada. And as we mark the 25th anniversary of the Westray mine disaster, where 26 miners were killed, I'm also extremely proud of the tireless efforts of the United Steelworkers, whose advocacy on behalf of Westray families resulted in the Westray Law. We just have to make sure that all levels of government enforce this law. Mr. Speaker, unions and their members have long been the proverbial canary in the coal mine, raising the alarm on many important issues. And any attempt by the Conservatives, whether in this House or in the other place, to make it harder for Canadians to join unions begs the question, why? Why the attack on the constitutional right for working men and women to organize themselves and join a union? Canadians have the right of freedom of association, and the card check system has served Canadian workers and Canadian workplaces well for decades. The previous government's Bill C-525 was just a thinly veiled attempt based on dubious anecdotal examples to tip the balance to the side of the employer. And employers already have the upper hand in most instances. Rather than refute once again the many problems of Bill C-525, allow me just to ask my Conservative colleagues, what is their motivation in bringing in such an obviously anti-union, anti-worker, and therefore, in my opinion, anti-democratic law? Or to quote Hassan Youssef from the Canadian Labour Congress, why would an employer care if workers want to join a union? If it's their free, democratic, and constitutional right in this country, why would employers want to interfere in it other than the fact that if you do have a vote, it gives the employer time to use all kinds of tactics during the time the vote has been ordered? I could list some of the companies that have clearly said they were going to close the facility or cut people's salary or lay people off. Of course, ultimately, it changed the workers' ability to truly exercise their free choice, end quote. There is no reason to make it harder to join a union other than to tilt the playing field unfairly towards employers. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned earlier, it gives me no pleasure to stand here today to speak to C4 again. In September of 2016, I stated in this House my hope that Bill C4 would receive swift passage so that the risks and restrictions brought about by the previous government's Bill C-377 and Bill C-525 would cease to exist. But here we are in May 2017 in a déjà vu situation. Just as the previous government's bills C-377 and C-525 were enacted by the Conservatives in a less than straightforward fashion, part of an omnibus bill through a private member's bill process, as opposed to being introduced and debated as government bills, so too have the Conservatives in the Senate engaged in what I believe are questionable tactics. Bill C-4 had already been adopted at second reading in the Senate, studied at the committee with no resulting amendments, and yet Conservative senators decide to break with parliamentary tradition and propose amendments at third reading. According to the Canadian Encyclopedia, and I quote, "The Senate has not vetoed a bill from the Commons since 1939. Very rarely makes amendments of principle. The amendments it does make to bills now are mostly always related to drafting, to clarify, to simplify, and tidy up proposed legislation," end quote. The amendments proposed by the Honourable Senators Tannas and Dagenais were most definitely not to clarify, simplify, and tidy, but rather they were designed to torpedo the contents of the entire bill. Yet, while the motives of the aforementioned senators are very clear, it remains a mystery as to why and how the government seemed unable to shepherd their own bill through the upper chamber. Back in September, when Bill C-4 was first debated, I congratulated the government on making good on one of their election promises. It would seem that my congratulations were a bit premature, Mr. Speaker. I hope that the government will take its responsibilities seriously and work diligently to ensure that it keeps this particular promise to Canadians, to restore some balance to the collective bargaining process, and to eliminate the onerous and unnecessary financial reporting requirements that the previous government imposed on unions. I had also enumerated for the government the many ways that we, as lawmakers, could make life better for Canadians. Last fall, at the one-year anniversary of the election, I expressed hope that the new government that had promised equality for women, fairness for Indigenous people, and sunny ways for all would work closely with all members in this House, as well as unions and civil society, to bring about better jobs and more secure future for all Canadians. I am disappointed that 7 months later, one of the government's very first pieces of legislation has yet to be passed. How much longer, Mr. Speaker, do workers have to wait? Mr. Speaker, the NDP said that Bill C-4 was a good first step, but we reminded the government that there is still much work to do and to be done. The previous government's omnibus Bill C-4 had decimated the health and safety provisions for public sector workers. We need to restore these important safeguards for the people who deliver our essential public services. As part of the promised labour policy reform, we asked the government to bring in legislation to update and modernize the Canada Labour Code. As we know, Mr. Speaker, sections of the code that deal with workplace harassment, hours of work, overtime pay and vacation entitlements are about 60 years out of date. It's time we modernize the code to reflect the reality of today's labour market. We have yet to hear from the government about this. Given the rise in precarious and involuntary part-time employment, will the Liberals work with unions ensuring that part-time, temporary and self-employed workers have the right to the same workplace and labour protections as other Canadians? These workers are faced with a host of added challenges that include eligibility for EI benefits. Erratic hours create challenges in pursuing an education, arranging childcare, and qualifying for a mortgage. And when will the government commit to reinstating a fair minimum wage for workers in federally regulated sectors? Some provinces and municipalities are already acknowledging that a living wage will make a huge difference in making life more affordable. Will this government step up and lead the way? We heard just the other day in this House how the government will be pursuing a national poverty reduction strategy. A critical element of a poverty reduction strategy, I would say, Mr. Speaker, and I think most people would agree, is a federal minimum wage.
Hear, hear.
As I've said before, Mr. Speaker, another sad fact is the disproportionate number of workers who would be helped by a federal minimum wage are women and young people. We cannot afford not to act. Through a combination of policy and propaganda, the previous government started to dismantle the system of protections that have been put in place by decades of advocacy by labour organizations and unions. Their right-wing agenda has generated policies that have hurt the environment, social services, and all workers, but especially persons of colour, Indigenous communities, women, the poor, and other marginalized groups. It is way past time for the federal government to bring in standalone pay equity legislation. We have studied this issue and consulted, and the evidence is clear and undeniable. 2 committee reports have called for action, yet the government is making women wait. It is unconscionable. All these are contributing factors to greater income inequality, and if the government is truly sincere about helping the middle class, then it must immediately address all these issues. But if this government cannot manage to stick-handle their own bill through the legislative process, what hope do we have that these pressing issues will ever get the attention they deserve? Affordable childcare, pay equity, decent accessible housing, and a living wage are all measures that would help Canadians from all walks of life. Mr. Speaker, it's not enough to state you're a feminist. It's not enough to stand beside union men and women during the election and raise your fist in solidarity. These are just words and gestures. We must follow that talk. That show of support with actions, with leadership, with the hard work of making hard decisions. Mr. Speaker, it's time to stop the rhetoric of gender lenses, gender-based analysis, of consultation, discussion, of a whole government approach. It is time to act, to do the hard work of governing. It is time to stop blaming the previous government for the inaction of this government. This government must pass legislation. You must bring in the changes you promised to the working men and women of this country. Mr. Speaker, I urge the government to finally make good on its promise to repeal the previous government's Bill C-525 and C-377, and to urgently return its attention to all the pressing issues facing Canadians. My NDP colleagues and I stand ready to help. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Employment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and my colleague across from Saskatoon West, she knows that I have a great deal of respect for the work that she has done and continues to do for workers in this country. Specifically on the bill, and one thing I was taken by when 525 had come to committee and I had the opportunity to sit in on all they only allocated 2 hours for witnesses on this, on a bill that changed the Canada Labour Code. Allocated two hours, and so the proponent of the bill, the member from Red Deer Lacombe, came in, and he was one of the witnesses, came in, did his own testimony, and left, didn't listen to the other ones. I thought that was a little bit strange, being a private member's bill. I thought that was odd. But the 2 things that stood out was when we asked whether or not he checked with any experts, and the answer was no. Did you speak with any people from the labor movement? No. Any academics? No. So really the consultation wasn't deep. And the other thing that he mentioned, it was in response to the mountain of grievances. Mountain of grievances. So when we asked the chairman of the IRB about the mountain of grievances, the total number of grievances against union bosses was really 2 over 10 years, 4,000 renderings, 2 against union bosses. So I would think that in this particular case, I'm sure that the member wanted to present in front of the committee. Would he have reaffirmed in his presentation in front of the committee on this bill, would he have reaffirmed those statistics?
The Honourable Member for Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague for reminding us of some important history about the changes that were proposed with Bill C-525 and 377. And I guess my comments on a couple of things that my honourable colleague mentioned. First was, I think it was really clear from all of the experts we saw and what we heard from those involved, both unions, employers, and government folks, that the way to change the labor code is in a tripartite model so that you keep the balance there. And of course, that didn't happen last time. Then we heard, we've heard from the Conservatives and we've heard from a few other people that there's this sort of mountain of evidence which we couldn't find. It was mostly anecdotal, that somehow people were, by using the card check system, that somehow people were being prevented from exercising their rights and their votes, and all of which, none of which we heard from the experts and the academics this time around. So I think what we heard and reaffirmed, and it's unfortunate that the Senate has sent it back, but from all people that are connected to workplaces, employers, workers, and those that draft legislation, that when we change the labor code, we need to do that in partnership in a tripartite model, and what the previous government did skewed that to the employer's interest. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Carleton.
We just heard a member of the House of Commons say that the right to vote is an attack on democracy. She says that giving workers the right to vote will allow them to be intimidated. What she should learn about the right to vote is that if executed properly, it happens through a secret ballot, which means neither the employer nor the would-be union would know how the worker voted, and therefore it would be impossible for the worker to be intimidated. In fact, that's how elections work. That's how all of us were elected. No member of this House can intimidate a voter because none of us actually know for sure how they voted. Because a person walking into the voting booth does so in privacy. The previous government enshrined this principle in the labor code to allow workers the same democratic protections. Now, if she's so worried about employers intimidating workers, why doesn't she allow those workers to make their decisions in private, out of the view, without the employer looking over the shoulder of the worker, the same way every other democratic country in the world operates? Or could it be that her party and the party across the way wants to give interest groups the ability to look over the shoulder of workers when they're deciding whether or not they want to vote? And the final question, she says, as the government has, that there was no tripartite consultation when we gave workers the right to vote. Tripartite being government, business, and unions. And you know what? Those are the last three powers that should be consulted. Because this is about workers' rights, not the rights of big government, big business, and big unions. It's the right of everyday workers to chart their own course, mark their own destiny, and make their own decisions without intimidation from any of those three powers.
Honourable member for Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my comments from my honourable colleague, and it gives me another opportunity to remind him about how workplaces are organized, and how I think in previous comments, I think he thinks somehow that the big balloon secret ballot pops out of the air and sort of arrives in a workplace, and somehow people know that it's time to vote. The problem with a secret vote is that it is announced in the workplaces, and what happens is that employers, and the evidence is there, intimidate workers because they know when the vote is happening, and that is what happens. It's not unions. And I think the comments, that's the evidence that's there. And what happens is employers intimidate employees prior to the vote. They know when it's going to happen. And that's why we saw the evidence and the research that those jurisdictions that bring in those changes the amount of unionization is reduced. And it's not reduced for the conclusion that my Conservative colleagues say is because people didn't want unions. It's reduced because working men and women who are trying to organize the shop floor get intimidated by employers saying they're going to close the plant, which has happened, that they're going to fire people, that they will demote people. And so a card check system is a democratic way for working men and women in workplaces to talk to one another and ask their workers to join a union, simply so that they have a collective person to help them organize, to collectively bargain a workplace. It doesn't change the workplace at all. I mean, it doesn't totally take away any employer rights. And so the union certification using card check is a way to ensure working men and women can exercise their constitutional right to organize.
Member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I wanted to pick up on one theme from my colleague's speech about the other place and the time that it's taken to get this bill shuttled through. I think one, and there's a couple ways that one could interpret the story of this bill. One, I think, which is the most charitable to the government, and the story that they would tell is that they're the victim of their own success. They made an independent Senate, and now that Senate, doesn't always behave as it should. And in this case, it's rejected the will of Canadian voters who overwhelmingly supported parties that thought the anti-labor legislation of the Harper era should be repealed, and so that took time, and they're going to hopefully come up with a plan to get it through the second time, although it's not clear what that plan is or how long it'll take. The other interpretation that's been suggested by some, of course, is that there are a number of important labor reforms that haven't happened. Some have been proposed, like in Bill C-34, I believe it is. We haven't seen anything about the Fair Wages Act coming back. We haven't seen meaningful pay equity legislation. One wonders maybe if the government isn't a victim of its own success, but that actually having C-4 stay in the system is a convenient excuse to not be pursuing these other important labor reforms. I wonder if the member wants to help us parse those various interpretations of what's going on.
Member Saskatoon West won't have too much time to help us with that because we only have a few seconds, about 20 seconds or so.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague for his comments. He's offered a couple of scenarios as to why things aren't proceeding, and I guess as quickly as the government has told us that they would. I mean, this bill, for example, was introduced almost a year ago. And I guess what I've said and what I said in my comments is that we are here to make sure and help the government follow through on its promises to working men and women, and we are ready to work, and we want this government to step up and start moving its legislation through the House. Thank you.
It is my duty